Picture a boy who becomes king at 20. In just 12 years, he conquers almost the entire known world, from Greece all the way to India. He never loses a single battle. He builds a city that still exists today. And then, at just 32 years old, he suddenly dies, and nobody is fully sure why. His name is Alexander, and they called him the Great. This is how one young man conquered the world, and what killed him. Over 2,300 years ago, in a kingdom called Macedon in northern Greece, a prince was born. His name was Alexander, and the year was 356 before Christ. His father was King Philip II, a brilliant warrior who had built the most powerful army in Greece. His mother was Queen Olympias, who told her son he was descended from heroes and gods. From the time he was small, Alexander was hungry, not for food, but for glory. The story goes that whenever his father won a new land, young Alexander would worry there would be nothing left for him to conquer. He didn't want to be just a king. He wanted to be the greatest who ever lived. Alexander's army was so effective partly because of one invention, the sarissa, a spear over 5 meters long, nearly twice the height of a man, carried by ranks of soldiers marching shoulder to shoulder in a tight formation called the phalanx. From a distance, an advancing Macedonian phalanx looked like a wall of iron teeth, bristling with spear points several rows deep, impossible for enemy infantry to break through head-on. Philip had spent years drilling this new formation into his men. By the time Alexander inherited it, it was the most feared infantry force in the entire Mediterranean world. When Alexander was about 12, a trader brought a magnificent black horse named Bucephalus to his father's court. But the horse was wild. It reared and kicked, and not one grown man could ride it. His father was about to send it away. Then young Alexander noticed something everyone else had missed. The horse was terrified of its own shadow. So Alexander calmly turned the horse to face the sun. So the shadow fell behind it, spoke to it softly, and climbed on. The whole court went silent as the boy rode the untamable horse. His father, amazed, is said to have told him, "My son, find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedon is too small for you." Bucephalus became Alexander's war horse for the rest of his life. Alexander's father wanted the best teacher in the world for his son. So he hired Aristotle, one of the most famous thinkers in all of history. For years, Aristotle taught Alexander science, medicine, philosophy, and politics. He gave Alexander a copy of the great poem, the Iliad, the story of the hero Achilles, and Alexander reportedly slept with it under his pillow, dreaming of being a hero just like him. So picture the mix now. A boy raised to believe he was born from gods, riding an unstoppable horse, trained by a genius, and dreaming of glory. All he needed was a throne. Alexander wasn't only shaped by his father, his mother, and his teacher. There was also Hephaestion, a Macedonian noble about his own age who grew up right alongside him. Ancient writers described the two as inseparable, and some even called Hephaestion Alexander's other self. For the next 20 years, wherever Alexander's armies marched, Hephaestion marched right beside him, eventually becoming one of his most trusted commanders. Behind the future conqueror was still a boy who needed a best friend. Before Alexander ever became king, his father gave him a real test. In 338 before Christ, at a place called Cheronea, Philip's Macedonian army faced the combined forces of Athens and Thebes, the two proudest cities in Greece, for control of the entire country. Philip trusted his 18-year-old son with command of the cavalry on the left wing. When Alexander saw a gap open in the enemy line, he didn't hesitate. He led his horsemen straight through it and smashed Thebes' legendary sacred band, an elite unit that had never been defeated in battle. The victory meant Philip could now force nearly every Greek city into a new alliance under his control, called the League of Corinth. A Greek unity that would soon become Alexander's inheritance, and the same unity that would come apart within a year of Philip's death. In the year 336 before Christ, it happened. At a grand wedding celebration, Alexander's father, King Philip, was suddenly assassinated, stabbed by one of his own bodyguards. In an instant, Alexander was king of Macedon. He was just 20 years old. Right away, enemies thought this young king would be easy to beat. Cities across Greece rebelled. But Alexander moved with terrifying speed, crushed the rebellions, and made all of Greece bow to him. Now he had his father's army, the best fighting force in the world. And he had one enormous target in mind, the biggest empire on earth, Persia. When Philip died and the Greek cities smelled weakness, Thebes led the revolt. Certain the new 20-year-old king wouldn't dare punish the city his own father had once respected. They were wrong. Alexander marched his army the length of Greece in barely 2 weeks, a speed nobody thought possible, and surrounded Thebes before help could arrive. When the city refused to surrender, Alexander's army stormed it, burned it to the ground, and sold thousands of its people into slavery. Only the house of the poet Pindar was spared, out of respect for the old master's work. The message to the rest of Greece was brutal and clear. No one would ever again mistake Alexander for an easy king. Before leaving for Asia, Alexander wanted to meet the most famous philosopher in Greece who wasn't Aristotle, a strange, fiercely independent thinker named Diogenes, who lived not in a palace but inside a large ceramic jar, owning almost nothing on purpose. When the young king found him sunbathing and asked if there was anything the most powerful man in the world could do for him, Diogenes barely looked up. "Yes," he said. "Stand a little out of my sunlight. You're blocking it." His officers were stunned, but Alexander reportedly walked away impressed, telling them, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." Even a conqueror could recognize when someone wanted absolutely nothing from him. To understand how bold this was, you have to understand Persia. The Persian Empire was gigantic, the richest, most powerful empire in the world, stretching across the whole Middle East. Its king, Darius III, ruled millions of people. And Alexander, a young king from a small kingdom, decided he was going to take it all. In 334 before Christ, he led his army across the sea into Asia. As his ship neared the shore, the story says he threw a spear into the sand, claiming the whole continent as a gift he would win by the sword. There was no turning back now. Alexander's first big test came at a river called the Granicus. The local Persian commanders were waiting for him on the far bank. It was a dangerous, uphill fight across a river. But Alexander did something his enemies never expected. He led the charge himself, right at the front, straight into the heart of the enemy. It nearly got him killed. A Persian noble's sword was already swinging down at his unprotected head when one of his own officers, a hardened cavalryman named Cletus, hacked the man's arm off just in time. Alexander owed his life to a single swing of Cletus's blade. His cavalry then smashed through, and Alexander won his first great victory. Now all of Asia Minor lay open before him, and word began to spread of a young king who fought at the front and could not be stopped. Not every Persian commander panicked in front of Alexander. A Greek mercenary general named Memnon of Rhodes, fighting for Darius, understood exactly how dangerous this young invader was. Rather than meeting Alexander head-on again after the Granicus, Memnon retreated to the coastal fortress of Halicarnassus, reinforced its walls, and burned the countryside behind him to starve Alexander's army. The siege that followed was brutal and slow, with towers, battering rams, and desperate night raids on both sides. But Alexander finally broke through. Memnon escaped by sea, still plotting, the one Persian commander who might have actually stopped Alexander if he'd only lived long enough to try. In a city called Gordium, there was a legend. An ancient chariot was tied with a knot so complicated that no one in history had ever managed to untie it. And the legend said, "Whoever undoes the Gordian knot is destined to rule all of Asia." Many clever men had tried and failed. Alexander looked at the impossible knot for a moment. Then he simply drew his sword and sliced it in half. Problem solved. Whether it really happened this way or not, It became the perfect symbol of Alexander. When other people got stuck on the rules, he made his own. Finally, the great King Darius himself came to destroy this young invader. In 333 before Christ, the two armies met at Issus. Darius had far more soldiers, some say more than twice as many. But Alexander aimed his charge straight at Darius himself. Terrified, the great king of Persia turned his chariot and fled the battlefield, leaving his own soldiers, his treasure, and even his family behind. The most powerful king on earth had run away from a 23-year-old. It was a humiliation Darius would never escape. Then Alexander reached a city that should have stopped him cold. Tyre, a mighty fortress built on an island out in the sea, with huge walls rising straight from the water. Everyone said it could not be taken. Alexander's answer? If he couldn't sail to it, he would build a road to it. His army spent 7 months constructing a giant stone causeway across the sea to reach the island, all while being bombarded with rocks and arrows. Then, with siege towers and battering rams, they smashed through the walls. Tyre fell. Alexander had literally reshaped the sea to win. Nothing, it seemed, could stop him. Quiz time. As a boy, Alexander was taught by one of history's most famous thinkers. Who was it? A. Plato. B. Aristotle. C. Socrates. The answer is Aristotle. Next came Egypt, and the Egyptians, who hated their Persian rulers, welcomed Alexander as a liberator and crowned him like a pharaoh. While he was there, Alexander stood on the coast and chose the spot for a brand new city. He named it after himself, Alexandria. It would grow into one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, home to a legendary library and a giant lighthouse, and it still exists in Egypt today. He also traveled deep into the desert to a famous oracle at Siwa, where the priests are said to have greeted him as the son of a god. From then on, Alexander began to believe he was more than just a man. Now came the biggest battle of Alexander's life. In 331 before Christ, on a wide plain called Gaugamela, King Darius gathered a truly enormous army to finally crush him. The Persians vastly outnumbered Alexander's men, with war chariots and troops from across the empire. Darius even had the ground flattened so his chariots could charge. But Alexander was too clever. He tricked the Persian line into stretching and opening a gap, then charged his cavalry straight through it, aimed right at Darius. Once again, Darius panicked and fled. And this time it was final. The greatest empire in the world had fallen to a 25-year-old. Alexander marched into the rich Persian cities of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis as the new master of Asia. On the road to the Persian capital, Alexander ran into the one obstacle that almost worked: a narrow mountain pass called the Persian Gates, blocked by a Persian commander named Ariobarzanes, with only a few thousand men. It was enough. Trapped in the narrow gorge, Alexander's army was pinned down by rocks and arrows raining from above, and for once he was forced to retreat. But like at Gordium, Alexander refused to accept a locked door. Local guides showed him a hidden mountain trail, and he led part of his army on a brutal night march around the pass, then attacked the defenders from behind. Ariobarzanes himself was killed trying to flee back to warn Persepolis, but he had bought the Persian capital several more weeks to try to hide its treasures. Treasure that would soon be captured anyway. Persia's own version of Thermopylae had fallen, and the road to its greatest cities lay wide open. In the great Persian capital of Persepolis, Alexander's army set the mighty royal palace ablaze. Some say as revenge for old Persian attacks on Greece. Meanwhile, the defeated King Darius was running for his life. But his own noblemen turned on him. One of them, named Bessus, took Darius prisoner and then killed him, hoping to take power himself. When Alexander found Darius's body, the story says he was angry. He had wanted to defeat Darius, not see him murdered by traitors. He gave the fallen king a royal funeral. Persia was now completely his. Quiz time. There was a legendary knot no one could untie. How did Alexander solve the Gordian knot? A. He untied it with a clever trick. B. He left it alone. C. He sliced it in half with his sword. The answer is, sliced it with his sword. You'd think that would be enough. It wasn't. Alexander pushed on, further east than any Greek had ever gone, through deserts and mountains, into lands like Bactria in modern Afghanistan. Along the way, he married a princess named Roxana. But something was changing. Alexander began wearing Persian robes and adopting Persian customs, and he wanted to be treated almost like a god. Many of his loyal Macedonian soldiers didn't like it. They had followed him across the world, and now their king was becoming a stranger. Still, Alexander's eyes were fixed on one more prize, a mysterious land at the edge of the world, India. The strain came to a horrifying head one night in 328 before Christ, at a drunken feast in Central Asia. An officer named Cletus, the same cavalryman who had once saved Alexander's life at the Granicus by cutting off an attacker's arm, began mocking Alexander's growing obsession with Persian customs and his father's memory. Furious, Alexander grabbed a spear from a guard and killed the man who had saved him in front of the entire room. He was reportedly consumed with grief and guilt for days afterward, refusing to eat. It remains one of the darkest moments of the entire story. The same hero who was once rescued by a friend's sword eventually turned one on him. The deeper Alexander pushed into Persia, the more he began ruling like a Persian king. And one custom caused real trouble. Persians traditionally bowed low to the ground before their king, a gesture called proskynesis. Alexander tried to introduce it at his own court, expecting his Macedonian and Greek officers to do the same. Many refused outright, seeing it as something you owed a god, not a man. One outspoken critic, a historian named Callisthenes, who happened to be Aristotle's own great-nephew, mocked the ritual openly. Not long after, he was implicated in a plot against Alexander's life and put to death. The boy who once slept with the Iliad under his pillow was starting to become someone his own teachers might not have recognized. In 326 before Christ, Alexander reached India and met a powerful king named Porus at the Hydaspes River. And Porus had a weapon the Greeks had never faced in battle: war elephants. Around 200 of them, huge and armored, terrifying to men and horses alike. In a thundering monsoon storm, Alexander secretly crossed the flooded river at night and attacked. The battle was brutal, but his long spears and clever tactics beat the elephants. Porus fought bravely to the very end. When the captured king was asked how he wished to be treated, he answered, "Treat me as a king treats another king." Alexander was so impressed that he let Porus keep his kingdom. Somewhere in India, Alexander met people unlike anyone he had faced before. A group of ascetic sages the Greeks nicknamed the Naked Philosophers, who owned almost nothing and questioned everything, even kings. One of them, a sage named Calanus, was so intriguing to Alexander that he joined the army's court and traveled with them for years afterward. Here was a man who had conquered nations, endlessly fascinated by holy men who had conquered nothing but their own desires. Alexander didn't just conquer land, he rebuilt it in his own image. Wherever his army went, he founded new cities, and most of them were named Alexandria after himself. From Alexandria in Egypt all the way to Alexandria Eshkart, the furthest Alexandria, deep in Central Asia in what is now Tajikistan. Even the modern city of Kandahar in Afghanistan is thought to get its name from an old Persian version of Alexander. In India, after his beloved horse Bucephalus finally died from old age and battle wounds, Alexander founded yet another city on the spot and named it Bucephala, a war horse who ended up with a city of his own. By the end of his life, more than 70 settlements across 3 continents carried some version of his name. Alexander wanted to keep going, to march to the very end of the world. But at the next river, the Hyphasis, his exhausted army finally said one word he had never heard before: no. They had marched for 8 years and thousands of miles. They were tired, homesick, and terrified of even bigger armies and more elephants ahead. One of his most trusted officers spoke for them all. They loved him, but they could not go on. For 3 days, Alexander sulked in his tent, hoping they would change their minds. They didn't. And so, for the first time, the unstoppable Alexander was stopped. Not by an enemy, but by his own worn-out men. He agreed to turn back. Quiz time. In India, Alexander's army faced an enemy they had never fought before. What was it? A. War elephants. B. Dragons. C. Giant eagles. The answer is war elephants. But turning back was not safe. Alexander led part of his army home through a terrible desert, where the burning heat and lack of water killed many of his men. Some say more died on that march than in any battle. The godlike conqueror, who had beaten every human enemy, could not beat the desert. Battered but still alive, Alexander finally reached the great city of Babylon, where he began dreaming up his next giant plans. New expeditions, new conquests. But he would never get the chance. Back in the Persian city of Susa, Alexander tried something no conqueror had really attempted before. He didn't just want to rule 2 peoples, he wanted to fuse them into one. In 324 before Christ, he organized a mass wedding. Dozens of his Macedonian officers married Persian noblewomen in a single ceremony, and Alexander himself took a Persian princess as his wife too. It was a bold experiment to build one new people out of 2 old ones. Not everyone back home was thrilled about it, but it showed just how far Alexander's ambitions had grown. Not only to conquer the world, but to blend it into something new. The year before, Alexander had lost his closest friend, Hephaestion, to a sudden illness in the Persian city of Ecbatana. And by all accounts, he was never quite the same again. In the summer of 323 before Christ, in Babylon, Alexander himself suddenly fell ill with a burning fever. For about 12 days, it grew worse and worse, until he could no longer even speak. And then, at just 32 years old, Alexander the Great died. To this day, no one knows for sure what killed him. Some ancient writers whispered it was poison. Modern doctors think it was more likely a disease, maybe typhoid fever or an infection carried by mosquitoes. The story says that when his dying friends asked who should inherit his empire, Alexander answered only, "To the strongest." Those 2 words would tear the world apart. Alexander left no grown-up heir and no clear plan. So his top generals did exactly what he said. They fought to be the strongest. For over 40 years, they carved up his empire in bloody wars. One general, named Ptolemy, grabbed the richest prize of all, Egypt. He even stole Alexander's body and brought it to the city Alexander had built, Alexandria. And here's the amazing part. Ptolemy started a royal family that would rule Egypt for nearly 300 years, all the way down to its very last pharaoh, Cleopatra. So Alexander's story and Cleopatra's story are actually the same story, 3 centuries apart. So how do we even know what Alexander actually looked like? He made sure of it. He hired the greatest sculptor of the age, a man named Lysippos, as his official portrait maker, and reportedly banned almost anyone else from sculpting his image. Those statues, and a famous mosaic uncovered many centuries later in the ruins of Pompeii, showing Alexander charging fearlessly into battle, are still how we picture him today, more than 2,000 years later. Alexander conquered more of the world by age 30 than almost anyone in history, and he never lost a battle. He spread Greek language, ideas, and cities from Egypt all the way to India, changing the world for centuries. Over 70 cities were said to be named after him. But he also died young, with everything he built already starting to crack. So here's my question for you. Was Alexander truly the Great, or just the luckiest, boldest gambler who ever lived? Tell me in the comments. And if you want to meet more rulers who once ran the whole world, subscribe. Once they ruled. See you in the next one.